Hi, everybody. For those of you who haven't seen me already, I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the State Library here in Maine. And since we are closed for the pandemic, I'm doing some online programming. And today I'm going to talk about probate records, why your patrons may want to find them, what they can show your patrons, and how you can help them find them, because while a lot of them are at Ancestry, even more are scattered other places on the internet. And so finding them can be a bit of a challenge. And not all of them are online yet. Deed records and probate records in the US, including here in New England, are done at the county level. And deeds have tended to go online because they're still being used to provide clear title. But yeah, an 1881 probate file is not active anymore. And other than those of us who are genealogists who want the information from it, nobody's going to go back and look at that for current use. So they've been less likely to be put online, which is one reason they're sometimes harder to find, because a lot of county deed records have been done by the Register of Deeds, and there's a website that just links to all of the Maine the 16 registries of deeds and their online access. There isn't anything similar for probate. So why do people want to find probate records? Well, there's a lot of information in many wills and estates that is very genealogically significant. The person who died will name relatives. They may name things they've inherited from somebody that they're passing on. Often the witnesses are somebody who's in their cluster of the people they interact with, often called their fan club, which is their family, associates, and neighbors. And so, those are the people who the person who died would have interacted with in life. And so probate files, there are multiple ways they can be set up. People can die either testate with a will or intestate without a will. And in some cases, it's actually more information if somebody died intestate without a will, because then a probate court had to figure out who the heirs were, what the person owned, and so there's paperwork on that. In a lot of early wills, meaning up through about World War I, there is, in addition to the will in a probate file, there's an inventory of what the person owned. Sometimes that inventory list will include people they owed money to as liabilities for the estate, or people who owed them money as assets for the estate. And again, those are people they interacted with in life. Is it a neighbor? Is it a school friend? Is it a brother-in-law? Is it their cousin who shares maternal grandparents? And you can figure out a mother's name from a cousin because you can find records on the cousin, but not on the person your patron's looking for. If there were children, there may be guardianship papers. And again, often the guardian chosen is an uncle or grandfather or cousin, occasionally an older brother. It's not unusual before the middle of the 19th century for children to have a guardian named if the father dies and the mother's still alive, especially if there's property involved, because that's somebody to look out for that child or those children's share of the estate. One of the other things to know is under English common law, which is what US law is based on. A widow was guaranteed what was called her dower right, which was usually a third of the estate. Sometimes it was for her life, sometimes it was until she remarried. But the widow had a right to a third of the estate that the husband could not will to anybody else. There's an interesting story showing how people don't necessarily understand how this works. William Shakespeare left his second best bed to his wife. And people take this as an insult. But actually, that would have been the bed they shared, and the best bed would have been for guests. So he's leaving his wife the bed that they had shared. So the dower right actually comes up in deeds as well, because if she has a right to a third of an estate, if he sells a farm, she needs to sign off on it, especially during the colonial era. You may see that, even if it's not mentioned specifically in the deed, you may see a wife signing the deed as an acknowledgement, so that even though she technically, because at that time, married women couldn't own property separate from their husband, she doesn't own the property, but that means she's acknowledging that they're selling her dower right. One slight difference in Quebec, and I talked more about this in my Quebec yesterday, French civil law, which Quebec law was based on, does not have the same legal issue for women that English common law did, where a woman's legal identity was basically subsumed to her husband. And so in Quebec, married women could own property, and they often came to a marriage with a dowry that was what they got then back when the husband died, or if they divorced. And so in there would be a marriage contract with a notary public. And so these are in what are called the notarial records. And so you will get marriage contracts, and you will get wills and inventories and guardianships in the notarial records, which are difficult to find sometimes because they're organized by the name of the notary rather than anyone else involved in the transaction. So know that this is done differently in Quebec. If you have you may not remember the details, but know that Quebec did things differently in a lot of cases. And so don't be surprised if you're helping somebody with French-Canadian ancestry, if you've got a different set of records to look at. So probate courts were some of the earliest courts to be initiated in New England, going back into the 1600s. There are indexes for many of the early probate records. Both Essex County, Massachusetts, and Middlesex County, Massachusetts have printed indexes. I know the State Library has copies from the beginning of the probate courts until the mid-1800s. And they tell you, they only index the name of the person the will was for. And occasionally you get, if it's a guardianship, you get the child's name. But they'll tell you whether it's the person died testate, intestate, guardianship, and so on. Many of those early New England probate records have actually been transcribed and printed. York County, Maine, which early on covered basically all of what was the District of Maine, as well as Essex and Plymouth counties, have had a fair number of probate records transcribed and published. So that's why they're, having the list of names of children, names of the wife, and so on can be very helpful. So I figured the easiest thing was to look at some of these so you could see the sorts of things you're going to get in an estate. So I'm going to share my screen. We'll hope the technology works. I'm still always a little surprised when it works. So you guys should have Ancestry up on your screen now. Okay. So this is a Zebulon Hill, and he died in 1699 in Massachusetts, in Essex County. He actually had a couple grandchildren who settled in Maine, and so that's one reason. I'm actually descended from him, but I had a patron come in looking for him that, you know, we're like, okay, we're 9th or 10th cousins, and so I'm glad I went looking for his probate with them. So this is interesting because it gives us, it tells us that he lives in Salem, in Essex County. He names his executor at one point. He says that he's got a Zebulon Hill, his son, had already predeceased him. Oops, hit the wrong thing. Apologies. Okay, you should have Ancestry back up. Okay. So he talks about his son Zebulon who predeceased him. So that identifies the Zebulon who had died in 1691. And here's where it gets interesting. So he leaves land in Wenham, in Beverly, and in Gloucester, in Massachusetts, to his heirs. And this is where it gets interesting, is up here, we have, he mentions his daughters. Well, he mentions his son Philip. Then he mentions his daughters, Elizabeth Marston, Abigail Allen, and Sarah Morgan. So you know, this can help you figure out which daughter married whom. Or if you have an Abigail Allen and you want to confirm that the Abigail Hill that married Benjamin Allen was the daughter of Zebulon, this will help you with that. The other thing is he mentions his grandchildren, Benjamin Ashby and Elizabeth Ashby, which tells you it's quite likely he had another daughter who has predeceased him, or she'd be mentioned with the 3 sisters, who married an Ashby and had 2 children who are still alive at the time their grandfather dies. And then he nominates his brother John Hill to be the executor. So that gives you another relationship to look into to see if you can figure out, if you didn't know who their parents were, instead of just looking for Zebulon, which is a nicely unusual name, you now know that you need to find a Zebulon Hill whose brother is John Hill of Beverly in Massachusetts. So can you see how these relationships in here are, you know, it's a gold mine to a genealogist. And so you then get the people who signed this. You get his wife's mark that she has agreed to this. And then right after this, we get the estate inventory. And so he was a cooper, and he has a cooper shop that's worth 75 pounds. And he has various other, you know, here's wooden dishes, here's a gun. He has 10 books that were worth $1 each. And so it tells you he's got a brass warming pan and 2 old skillets that are worth a total of 12 shillings. And you know, the will can be dated before he died. The inventory is going to be after he died. So the will and the inventory together, if there isn't a death record for this man in the vital records, the will and the inventory can give you bookends of the time when he would have died, because they may be 2 or 3 years apart, because he may have written the will at one point when he was sick, recovered, never changed it, and then when he did die, you get the inventory and the probate, and therefore you have an end time where he must have died before the inventory happened. Usually the people who do the inventory are not related. The probate court tried on the inventory to often nominate people to do the inventory who have no interest in the estate, so that they're, you know, a neutral party figuring out the what the person owns before it's split up. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So that's, and so you can see they were just written in the book like this, and here's the next person. One thing interesting is on these, this February 1699 is almost certainly what we'd call February 1700, because at this point the year was starting on Lady Day, which was March 25th. So January and February would have been listed in the previous year. And I've had patrons get very confused by that, and think in some cases that the estate is proven before somebody died. And it's not that, it's just the calendar was slightly different. So let's take a look. So here's a Henry Kent who died in 1880 in Wenham, Massachusetts. And here's his estate, or his probate file, very nicely done up. And by this point in the 1880s, they have, for the probate court, pre-printed forms, because most of this wording is the same. And again, you get Louisa R. Kent, you get the name of the deceased was Henry S., where he last lived, what his occupation was, the date he died. She's the one petitioning. Here's a list of all their children, except you also get, so you get Robert Kent, Louisa Putnam. So Robert's living in East Boston, Louisa's living in Danvers, Kate Starrett is living in Chicago. And then there are these Sears and other grandchildren, these Sears grandchildren by his deceased daughter, who were all living in Danvers. One reason I put this one up that's really interesting is Louisa had actually been living for at least 15 years before Henry died with their daughter Kate in Chicago, but she's still legally the widow. And again, you get this case where you have the grandchildren listed showing that a child had died before the father and grandfather. So you get the petitioner saying what the relationship is, and you get these are people interested signing off, the daughters, and then again you get the whole estate dealt with, and it goes on for several pages of detail about what's involved and the petition. And you know, they have these people looking at the estate books and so on. And then again, you get various people involved signing. And on a lot of these are the signatures that, you know, sometimes you get books where they've copied it, but and the clerk has written the signatures. But by this point, you're getting, here's Louisa Kent, who is at this point 81 years old, signing it. And you can see her handwriting looks like an older woman's. This is a son-in-law, Albert Putnam. I don't remember off the top of my head who William was. And so you get the whole process. And one more example, this is Lucius Waterman. And I thought this was interesting because if we go into his, he's out in Wisconsin, which this is a case where this varies less around the country than some other things. You're going to tend to have people in other parts of the probate works more the same way across the country. So he's out in Wisconsin. So he leaves by his widow Rachel, their children, John James, their children, and then John James and Harriet blank, because he isn't sure what her married name is, wife of blank by a former wife. So you get, so he's got a widow and 6 children. 3 of the children are by the former wife, and William, Garrett, and Anna, who's the wife of, I think it's Calvin Searle, by the widow. So this nicely breaks down which wife had which child, which sometimes is hard to tell if you don't have birth records that are good. I picked this, I've seen this in Maine as well, where you get the breakdown of which child by which wife in the probate. I just couldn't remember one of those examples off the top of my head to show you, but I knew that this one had that. And so this is one of the other nice things, is that often the probate does divide the children. It doesn't always, but it will divide the children by marriage if he had children by more than one wife. So that's helpful. So let me just go at Ancestry. If you're looking for, if you search, it's not listed under the search, but if you search all collections, and we'll put in Lucius Waterman, and we'll hit search, because somebody asked about, they pop up. They come up under, not under birth, marriages, and deaths, but under court, land, wills, and financial, if they're at Ancestry. So again, here you have a Wisconsin probate. And you get early tax assessment things in the same category. But they, as I said, they come up under the court, land, and wills category rather than the death records. Okay, so that's where they're located at Ancestry. If we go to this is the FamilySearch wiki for Maine, and it does a fairly good job of giving you a lot of Maine wills and probate are at Ancestry. They are also at FamilySearch. If we go into United States, Maine, and then Kennebec County, you can see that they are that way, but they'll be at the county level, not at the city level. So you'd have to look for Kennebec, not Augusta. Does that make sense to everybody? And the one tricky one is to remember with York, you're looking for the county of York, not the city of York. Because there are records at both those levels. Same thing with Hillsborough, New Hampshire. There's, you know, a town of Hillsborough and a county of Hillsborough. So that's, but yeah, and if you go in here, so I'm in the Maine genealogy, you can either go to probate records, looking at sort of the whole state, or if we want to choose Kennebec, come on, my internet's not that slow. And we go in here, you also get probate for the county. This is not, some of these are built out much more, often because they're, you know, things are in multiple places. So they are the FamilySearch wiki. And there's overall a whole United States probate that has some good background and some links if you're interested in more details on that. I want to briefly, I briefly mentioned Quebec being a little different, and that a lot of the wills are in the notarial records. I want to briefly mention about England and Ireland up to 1922. In England until 1832 or 34, up until the 1830s, let's go with that. Ecclesiastical courts handled probate, and in the 1830s, they started civil probate courts. And so they publish these annual, you know, for genealogically relevant times, they publish these annual indexes. And I'm going to go to this one because it's easier to read. To the wills that were proved, and I'll show you, this is the National Probate Calendar. And this tells you the person's name, where they lived, when they died, which probate district it was, and who the primary heir or executor was, and the amount of the estate. And so you can see here, these range, you know, we've got one that's 2,500 pounds, one that's 66 pounds, one that's 830 pounds. And so you can kind of get a idea looking around the page, you know, is this 9,540 pounds a substantial estate? And it's one of the larger ones on the page. But again, this is nice because in England, you have to pay to get the vital records online are indexes, and they're only indexed to quarter. So you get first, second, third, and fourth quarter of the year in the index. And because people had 6 weeks to register something, if somebody died in April, it may actually be, or in March, it may actually be listed in the second quarter for April, May, June, and you don't get an exact death date. So if they left an estate that was proven in probate court, you will get the exact death date in that record, which can be helpful. There, a much smaller percentage of the population in the UK would have had a probate file because so many fewer people owned their land. But some people did. I have a case where, you know, a couple greats aunt, you know, in the 1880s left, you know, a 47-pound estate. And I guess because she was a soldier's wife, she had done a will, and it, so it isn't listed in the index. But just so you know that index is at Ancestry if you need it. For Scotland, all of the wills and testaments and all of that are at Scotland's People, because Scotland, even though it's part of the UK, has a separate legal system for some of this than England does. But you know, the big issue is that these records are scattered in a lot of cases. Yes, they're at Ancestry or FamilySearch, but it's also not unusual. I have found them at county website, county court, county level websites. I've found them at some of the early probate records I have found at various historical society websites. That's more common in south of here, in the mid-Atlantic and south. So the FamilySearch wiki is a good place to start, to drill down to the county to see where the records are. And I've more than once, it's been a Google search of, county name, state, probate records to see what I can find. Yeah, it's interesting question here is about, in England and Ireland, the records also at the county level. It's not quite the county level. A lot of counties had multiple, like Yorkshire had 3 or 4, which is why it's telling you Wakefield. And other cases, London covered most of Middlesex County. But here's a case where this man, Herbert Weather, died in Bradford, and for some reason, his will was proved in London. I don't know, without looking further, I don't know why. So you will see cases like that. Here's one where this is part of Wales, and it was proven in Manchester in England. So, like Yorkshire had Wakefield and York, and I think one other district, which is why this index is nice, is because, so it may well be that for these, for this one, he may have owned land in London. His widow might have moved there with her to be near her family. The other thing, I'm looking at this, it's possible he was a veteran and so had veterans benefits through the Chelsea Hospital in London, which is how some of the veterans benefits were done in England. And that's why it's in London, is because of that connection with the Chelsea London pensioners. But that's one reason this index is nice, is it is the national probate calendar. So it's everybody for that year. Ireland probate gets strange because you have things before and after independence. But they have a similar calendar. Because Ireland is interesting because there's some things that they do the way the English did, and then some things they do their own way. And Northern Ireland is even more split. But that's sort of the overview of probate records. And because they are helpful, it's worth, if a patron hasn't looked at them, looking at the index. Especially a place here like Maine, if you have somebody dying in the 1870s or 80s, their probate file may be, there may well be a will or an inventory, but there wasn't an actual death record because the town didn't keep them before 1892. The other thing is, there are sometimes, if there's an estate, if somebody has an approximate birth or death date, it may be worth looking at the local newspaper to see if there's an ad from the administrator of the estate asking for people who have claims on the estate to come forward. because that's another way. If you have an approximate death date, but want more details or to see who the administrator was, those ads can sometimes be helpful. I've been at least one case, that's where I found a widow's name that I hadn't found anywhere else. Is looking, and she was in the 1880s, was named as the administrator of her husband's estate. And because it was here in Maine, there wasn't a marriage record from the 1870s. And so we were able to figure out her name from that ad, because she was named in the will as my beloved wife with no name. It didn't happen, there was no signed paperwork with the will, but we found an ad that had her first name in it. So any other questions at this point? But yeah, the big thing is, this is something patrons tend not to look at because it is sometimes confusing to find them. But they're worth finding. I know when I was at Belfast, it was really nice. The library is practically across the street. I could take somebody to the window and say, go over to that door over there and take a look. Can't quite do that at the State Library for Kennebec County. But there is valuable information. As I said, you get children named, often daughters by married names. You can sometimes guess at a death date. It's not unusual. I've seen many cases where somebody says, and the fields I live in Salem, but the field I inherited in Danvers from my father goes to so-and-so. And so that can be a way of figuring out, then going back to the deeds and figuring out who owned that piece of land if you aren't sure who that person's father was. I've definitely done that in Maine, where you get somebody inherited an extra bit of land and left it to a nephew instead of to his children because he'd inherited it from the father or grandfather. So, any questions? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I guess I'll stop the recording at this point.